In the words of Will Roger, invest in inflation, it's the only thing going up. Hello everyone, I am Dr. Shumaila Hassan, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics from the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. And today we are here in this video going to talk about what is inflation. Let's understand an overview of what we are going to present to you in this video. First and foremost, we'll be talking about understanding inflation. Second, we'll be going on to talk about what and how do we define inflation. Thirdly, we'll talk about what exactly is purchasing power. Next, we'll go on to define the types of inflation, just an introduction, that is in brief. Next, we'll talk about the demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. So let's first try and understand what exactly inflation is. In economics, inflation is a general rise in the price level in an economy over a given period of time. When the general price level rises, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. Consequently, inflation reflects a reduction in the purchasing power per unit of money, and definitely a loss in the real value in the medium of exchange and unit of account within an economy. The opposite of inflation is deflation, that is, a sustained decrease in the general price level of goods and services. The common measures of measuring inflation over the period of time in an economy are the inflation rate, the annualized percentage change in the general price index, and the consumer price index. Now let's try and personify inflation and deflation. If we try to personify these two concepts, inflation can be called as a genie, and deflation on the other hand can be called as an ogre that must be fought very decisively. Now let's talk about the dictionary meaning or the dictionary definition of what inflation aims at. Inflation basically aims to measure the overall impact of the price changes for a diversified set of products as well as services. And it allows for a single value representation of the increase in the price level of the goods and services in an economy over a specified period of time. While it is easy to measure the price changes of individual products and services, but over time, the human needs extend beyond one or two such products and services. The individual definitely need a big and diversified set of products and services for a comfortable living. They include commodities like the food grains, metal, fuel, utilities like electricity and transportation, and services like healthcare, entertainment, and labor. Therefore, inflation is measured with respect to a bundle of goods and services that a unit of money can buy. As currency loses its value, price rises, and it buys fewer and fewer goods and services. This loss of purchasing power impacts the general cost of living of the common man, which ultimately leads to a deceleration in the economic growth. The consensus view among the economists is that sustained inflation occurs when a nation's money supply growth outspaces its economic growth. Now, I used the word purchasing power. So let's talk about this term purchasing power and try to define it. The word purchasing power or the term purchasing power is the value of the currency expressed in terms of the number of goods and services that one unit of money can buy. Purchasing power is important because all else being equal, like we use in economics, ceteris paribus, inflation decreases the number of goods or services you would be able to purchase. Let's take a very simple example with respect to how we define purchasing power. In 2011, if I would have given you rupees 1,000, you would have bought 20 units of commodity X and 50 units of commodity Y. But that same 1,000 rupees in 2021 might not be able to buy the same amount of goods of X as well as Y for you. This is reduction in purchasing power with respect to the inflation over a period of 10 years. Now the question is, when does inflation occur, right? So as we mentioned in the previous slide, inflation occurs when a nation's money supply growth outspaces the economic growth. That means too much money chasing too few goods. Now let's take a historical example to understand this better. Theoretically, monetarism is a popular theory that explains the relation between inflation and the money supply of an economy. For example, following the Spanish conquest of Aztec and Inca empires, massive amounts of gold, especially the silver, flowed into the Spanish economy and definitely the other European countries as well. Since then, the money supply rapidly increased, the value of money fell, contributing to rapidly rising prices. But certainly, inflation is something that has to be combated well. To combat this, a country's appropriate monetary authority, like the central bank, then has to take necessary measures like the adjustments under the monetary and the fiscal policy to manage the supply of money and credit to keep inflation within the permissible limits and keep the economy running smoothly. In such cases of money supply increase, the money loses its purchasing power. The mechanism of how this drives inflation can be classified into three types. So here we are to discuss about the types of inflation. The first type of inflation is the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation. That means because of excess money in the economy, the demand for goods and services rises. Demand pull inflation occurs when an increase in the supply of money and credit stimulates the overall demand for goods and services in an economy. And finally, it leads to increase in prices. And why? Because there is a rapid increase in the goods and services demand with respect to the economy's production capacity. With more money available to individuals, positive consumer sentiments leads to higher spending. And this increased demand pulls the prices to a higher level. It creates the demand-supply gap with higher demand and less flexible supply, which results in higher prices. Now let's talk about the cost push inflation. This type of inflation occurs when there is an increase in the prices of the factors of production which are used for any production process. The cost push inflation is a result of increase in the prices working through the production process inputs. When addition to the total supply of money and credit are channelized into a commodity or other asset markets, and especially when this is accompanied by a negative economic shock to the supply of key commodities, costs for all kind of intermediate goods rises. These developments lead to a higher cost for finished products or services and work their way into the rising consumer prices. For instance, when the expansion of money supply creates a speculative boom in the oil prices, the cost of energy of all sorts of uses can rise and contribute to the rising consumer price, which is reflected in various measures of inflation. The third type of inflation is the built-in inflation. Now, what is built-in inflation? Built-in inflation is related to adaptive expectations. The idea that the people expect the current inflation rates to continue in the future as well. As the prices of goods and services rises, workers and others come to expect that they will continue to rise in the future in the similar manner and with the same rate and demand more costs or wages to maintain their standard of living. Their increased wages results in a higher cost of goods and services. And this wage price spiral continues as one factor induces the other and vice versa. I use the term wage price spiral. So let's try and understand what is the meaning of this word wage price spiral. As the word itself suggests, it's a spiral. which means one thing leading to the other leading to the other, and again coming back to the first one. The wage price spiral is a macroeconomic theory used to explain the cause and effect relationship between rising wages and rising prices or inflation. The wage price spiral suggests that rising wages increases the disposable income, raising the demand for goods and services and causing the prices to rise. Rising prices increases the demand for higher wages, which leads to a higher production cost. And this higher cost leads to an upward pressure on the prices, creating a conceptual spiral. Now let's talk about the relationship between this wage price spiral and inflation in a little bit of more detail. The wage price spiral is an economic term that describes the phenomena of price increase as a result of higher wages. Now, when the workers receive a higher wage hike, they demand more goods and services in the economy, and this in turn causes prices to rise. The wage increases effectively. Definitely, the general business expenses also increase, and these general business expenses increase is passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. It is essentially a consistent or a perpetual loop or the cycle of consistent price increases. The wage price spiral reflects the causes and consequences of inflation, and it is therefore a characteristic of the Keynesian economic theory. So this was a brief introduction about what is inflation, what was the dictionary meaning of inflation, what is the meaning of purchasing power, how can we define inflation, what are the three types of inflation in brief, and what is the meaning of wage price spiral. In the next module, we are going to discuss about what is demand pull inflation and cost push inflation in detail. Thank you.